Chapter 8. Here to Stay. Despite his obvious non-interest in anything to do with finding the road to salvation here at New Eden, Phonte does his utmost best to stifle all comments of sarcasm and mockery as the preacher takes him and Miko on a brief tour of the church. This level of restraint, of course, takes massive effort on the part of Phonte, since the preacher's incessant pontification of God's greatness at every open opportunity was starting to sound like a broken record. Even Miko, who seems more open to the idea of what New Eden represents, can't hide her exasperated body language that gets more and more obvious every time the preacher goes off on one of his "God is good" tangents. Together, they patiently let him ramble off holy parables and religious edicts uninterrupted until the tour ends with them back where they started in the chapel nave. As they enter the main arcade of the church, they're approached from the pulpit by the three men who were seen conversing with the preacher earlier when Phonte and Miko first arrived at the church with Rose. The man in the lead looks vaguely familiar to Phonte as he moves to intercept the preacher along his path to the nave. "Reverend, may I have a moment, please?" the unidentified man says as he reaches the preacher. The preacher nods agreeably as the gruffly chiseled, tall, red-haired man leans his head near the preacher's right ear and whispers a few inaudible sentences to him. Miko and Rose stand by patiently and wait a few moments until the exchange is over, but Phonte makes no effort to mask his exasperation. Now, mindfully aware of everyone's eyes on them, the preacher whispers back a quick response, then breaks away and nods his head toward the newcomers, Phonte and Miko. "And before you go, please allow me to make some quick introductions for everyone," the preacher says with great enthusiasm as he sweeps his right hand outward toward the pair and continues speaking. "Hugo, this is Phonte and Miko. Phonte and Miko, please meet Hugo, leader of the Reckoners, who you may or may not recognize as the one who saved you from the mob of Ravengers and brought you here to New Eden. Behind him, that's Jonas and Vincent, also righteous Reckoners in the service of our Lord and Savior." Miko steps forward without pause and responds first. "Well, let me be the first one to say thanks for pulling our asses out of that fire. I don't even want to think what would have happened to us if you hadn't shown up when you did," she says with sincerity as she clasps her hands together under her chin and gives a slight bow of appreciation. Phonte just shrugs dismissively as he offers a crooked smile of mock smugness. "If they hadn't shown up, we would have found a way out on our own. That's what would have happened," he says with snide humor in his tone as he shakes each man's hand. "But yeah, all jokes aside, thanks for getting our backs though. We definitely owe you one." Miko just rolls her eyes as she cracks a smile at Fonte's relentless pursuit of belligerent humor. At this point, what else could she do? As far as she was concerned, she either had to roll her eyes and ignore him or hit him in the face with a sledgehammer until he stopped. The only thing was, she kind of found herself liking the way his face looked right now, so she elected to go with the former. "Well, now that everyone has been properly introduced, off you go. I'll be sure to join you as soon as we're finished here," the preacher says as he shoos Hugo and his Reckoners off toward the door near the pulpit at the north end of the nave. Once they've departed, with Vincent remaining by the pulpit to stand guard, the preacher turns around on his heels to face Phonte and Miko as he motions for them to sit down in one of the pews. "So now that you've had a chance to walk among the patrons of New Eden and see how we live, perhaps it's time we learned a little more about the two of you and the story of your journey after the rapture," he says very charmingly as he sits himself in the pew in front of them. A look of perplexing confusion stretches across Fonte's face as he briefly looks to Miko for some kind of clarification, but he finds none. "What do you mean? You guys pretty much know the story of our journey so far and how we ended up here," Phonte says with a fixed tone of voice that openly reflects his growing impatience. "I think what my husband means is that he'd like to hear the story of where you come from and how you managed to survive on your own until now. You know, stuff like that." The preacher smiles with gracious warmth at his wife and nods his head. "Yes, that would be as good a place as any to start. And I don't mean to pry. I just have a curious mind that loves to gather information. But if you don't feel like sharing, that's okay as well. It's just been a while since any newcomers have come to New Eden and shared their experiences with us, and newcomers are basically one of the few ways we still have left to gain information about the current events unfolding outside our walls." Now nodding in understanding and acknowledgement, Phonte leans back in the pew and folds his arms across his chest. He was tired of the small talk and just wanted to get back on the road. But even though he's currently super annoyed with all the small talk and the religious exaggerations, he decides to continue playing along and hopes that the preacher will lower his guard and reveal some useful information about New Eden that might give him and Miko an idea of what to do when they finally did leave this place behind them. Well, Miko will probably be the best one to tell that story. She's been around after the rapture, for longer and knows a hell of a lot more about what's been happening out there than I do. I just joined this end of the world party a few days ago, Phonte says with a slightly crooked smile toward his female companion, who gives him a look of irritation for being volunteered to speak without her permission. After the humorous exchange between the two companions, Miko sets her minuscule aggravation with Phonte aside for a moment and takes his lead as she begins telling their story as best she can. She tells them of how she came to find out everyone in the world had vanished and how she and her father had spent months running from mobs of brain-dead lunatics until the day he gave his life to save hers. She speaks of the various temporal anomalies she's experienced and how the laws of nature have continued to deteriorate around her bit by bit and day by day. Several minutes pass as Miko continues speaking in detail about fleeing Toledo and making the arduous voyage to Columbus in search of refuge from the huge flocks of crazies tearing her city apart. She goes on to explain how she eventually met Phonte by saving him and his dog Casper from dying at the hands of a crazed neighbor. She takes her time explaining this point and places special emphasis on reminding Phonte that he still owes her a favor for saving his bacon despite what happened in his mother's office downtown. From there, Miko continues recounting how they agreed to work together in search of Fonte's family while looking for answers about the vanishing along the way. The preacher and Rose attentively listen to the story without a single interruption as she finally closes off by retelling the final incident that took place downtown, which led to them being rescued by the Reckoners. Seemingly satisfied with the explanation, the preacher nods silently and sits back into his pew as he considers the story in its entirety. After a few moments of contemplation, a ghost of a smile can be seen crawling over his charismatically weathered face as he finally speaks his thoughts on the matter. Well now, it sounds like you've both had quite the adventure indeed. And from your story, I have to say, even a blind man can see that the Almighty God had his hand at work in bringing your path here to New Eden, he says prophetically as he continues smiling with infectious charm. For Phonte, it takes every ounce of willpower that he possesses to keep himself from reaching out and smacking Francis the preacher man right across the face as he makes yet another attempt to force God into the conversation. It was almost as if the man was trying to sell them on the idea of God like he was trying to sell a car, and it was becoming super aggravating super quickly. As a staunch believer in human rights, Phonte considers himself to be ultra respectful of others and their right to believe and practice any religion that they see fit. His problem with people who practice religion, like Francis the preacher here, is because they seem not to care about respecting the rights of others who choose to not believe in ancient superstitious beings and inconsistent fables of mysticism. However, having the clarity of mind to set this extraneous difference in personal beliefs aside, Phonte ignores the religious insinuations and decides to use the preacher's own tactic against him. What about you, preacher? Care to tell us how God put you on the path to finding New Eden? Don't be shy, Phonte says with a hint of mockery tinging his voice. To this, the preacher smiles and scoffs with emphatic pride. This old preacher hasn't gotten anything to be shy about at all, young man, he begins to say as he repositions himself on the pew in front of Phonte. As an emissary of the Almighty Lord above, I'm always willing to share my life experiences as a way of illuminating the road of salvation for others. Still straining to keep a straight face at this point, Phonte ignores the fanatical response and keeps quiet as he waits for Francis to continue. After the great rapture that took all of God's true believers and delivered them to heaven, which for me was around 6 years ago, give or take a few months, I woke up to find that I was alone with no sign of anyone in sight. So naturally, I went looking for help, much like I expected you two did after seeing the absence of all people around you, he says engagingly. Weeks passed as I wandered aimlessly, talking to myself and scavenging scraps for food, and after a few months of being chased by those who became possessed by demons, I lost my will to live, and I attempted to commit suicide. I had had enough. The air stills with an audible pause of ambiguity as Phonte and Miko sit listening very assiduously to the preacher speak. Rose crosses the aisleway and seats herself next to the preacher on the back side of the pew bench and leans against him affectionately to show her support as he recounts the darkest moment of his life. Even though she's heard this story and discussed it in detail with her husband many times over the course of their marriage, it still gives her chills to imagine his descent into such a dark state of mind. Francis graciously accepts his wife's comforting presence as he looks intently into the faces of Phonte and Miko with his sharp blue eyes of glassy fire and continues speaking. I took a rope, found me a good, sturdy scaffold to serve as my gallows, and I said my last prayer, which coincidentally just so happened to be the first prayer that God Almighty ever answered. And what did you pray for, Father? Phonte asked with a forceful effort to keep the incredulity out of his voice. Salvation, of course, the preacher responds smoothly. I prayed for salvation, then stepped off the scaffold to end it all right then and there. I hung there for what seemed like an eternity, and just when I felt the last bit of life choking from my conscious body, wham! The rope around my neck suddenly snapped, and I found myself on my knees seconds away from passing out. It was there on my hands and knees, with my chest heaving and gasping for air through a throat clenched in fire, that I finally received my revelation. It was in that moment of spiritual deliverance that God spoke to me and everything became clear for the first time in my life. And I haven't looked back ever since. Miko sits up straight in her seat as she politely addresses the preacher with an honest question of interest. I don't mean any offense by this or anything, but if you believe that the rapture took all of God's true believers away to heaven, what makes you think God would be bothered to answer the prayer of someone he left behind? Isn't it more believable that you just got lucky and picked a crappy rope to try and hang yourself with? Francis chuckles a little bit as he simpers at Miko with warm fondness. First of all, no offense taken at all, my dear. It takes more than someone questioning my faith to offend me. You haven't been the first, and I'm sure you won't be the last, he says truthfully. As far as why I believe God saved me, the answer to that is simple. My faith. My faith in what I saw when I received revelation. And what did you see exactly? Phonte chimes in from the side with a strained tone of politeness. What I saw doesn't matter, since there's no way for me to prove to you what I saw. What matters is what happened after I saw what God wanted me to see. For a moment, there was another audible pause as Phonte and Miko tried to read between the lines of his vague response. From there, I set off to carry out God's will with a renewed purpose, and after weeks of traveling in solitude outside the city, I blindly stumbled upon this place of New Eden and began to set up shop. It wasn't as established and expansive as it is now, of course, but even back then, all those years ago, I knew this would be the last sanctuary of salvation for the lost soul seeking redemption before the end of days. So I got to work immediately. The preacher says ardently as he reaches his left hand around Rose's shoulders and embraces her next to his side. From there, a month or so went by before I came across the first of those who would come to take refuge here at New Eden. Rose and Hugo were both among them, the preacher says with a quick side wink to Rose on his left as he continues. Together, we began building a home here while searching for more survivors of God's rapture and using our faith to dispatch any demon ravagers we came across along the way. This is when we formed the Reckoners. Rose nods in acknowledgement as she continues listening to her husband retell their story. Miko leans forward attentively and allows herself to become more engaged with the tale, while Phonte does his best to conceal the impatience he was feeling from showing on his face. Over time, the Reckoners slowly but surely guided more survivors to our collective as we began expanding the settlement out to include other neighboring lands and continuing to build. More years passed, and as New Eden became more established, the day finally came when we suddenly found ourselves under attack from a swarm of ravagers that almost destroyed our home, Francis says ominously as he continues speaking. The fight itself lasted days, and we suffered what seemed like the heaviest of losses along the way, but we finally ended the demonic threat and then spent the next few years building walls to protect the community that you now see today. Ever since then, we've lived in relative peace and harmony without much trouble. This is something you'll see as you start to get settled into your new life here at New Eden. It was the last sentence that caught Phonte's attention as he blurts out his next words without any forethought. New life? Who said anything about starting a new life here? Wherever here is, we weren't planning on staying and building any kind of life here. We're just passing through, he says with genuine confusion as he looks back and forth from the preacher to Rose. Startled by the abrupt interruption, Francis slightly tilts his head to the side curiously as he quickly responds. God has brought you here for a purpose, young man. Would you really so foolishly turn your back on salvation just so you can wander amongst the denizens of darkness? Phonte has heard enough at this point and abruptly stands to leave. This causes everyone else to rise as well, with Rose slipping back into the aisleway and outside of the peripheral vision of both he and Miko. Okay, Father Francis, I'm just going to stop you right there because I really don't have time for any more of this religious bullshit, Phonte says with an unapologetic tone of voice. Look, we sincerely appreciate you pulling our asses out of the frying pan back there in the city, and we're really flattered by your generous offer, but we're definitely going to pass. I still have a brother to find out there, and I've got no time to waste sitting here singing Kumbaya, my lord, with a bunch of Jesus freaks. No offense. None taken at all, the preacher says with a thin-lipped smile. However, I'm afraid I still cannot let you leave New Eden. Now it was Miko's turn to blurt out a response with confused irritation. And why is that exactly? Is everyone else a prisoner here too? She says with a mild hint of hostility evident in her tone of voice. I assure you, there are no prisoners here, considering that in all the years of New Eden's existence, no one has ever requested to leave. Deciding to put a little distance between him and the two newcomers, Francis slips out into the aisleway and gestures with his hands for the two of them to calm down. I'm sorry. If I let you leave, that means I must let you leave with the knowledge of New Eden's location, and that's simply unacceptable. In order for New Eden to stay protected as a safe haven for others, it has to remain a secret at all costs. I hope you understand. Are you kidding me right now? You're telling me that you aren't going to let us leave because you want to keep a secret? Phonte asks incredulously as he almost shouts across the pew into the aisleway. Who the hell do you think we're supposed to tell your precious secret to? Newsflash, Father, everyone's gone. The preacher shakes his head emphatically as he gestures at the world around them with his hands. Clearly everyone isn't gone, young man, and even if they were, you both are still here. How are we to know that the knowledge you take with you won't make you a threat to us in the future? Who's to say you won't leave and return with enough weapons to pillage us for our resources and take over our sanctuary? I don't know, Frankie. You're the damn preacher. Shouldn't you have faith in God to protect you or something? Seeing the conversation really starting to spiral out of control, Miko decides to interject once more in order to see if a compromise can be reached. So how about this? If you want the place to stay a secret, why can't you just blindfold us, load us up in a vehicle of some sort, and drop us off back in the city where you found us? Easy fix, she says calmly as she tries to keep a cool head on her shoulders. To this, Francis lets out an exasperated sigh of disappointment. I wish there was some way to accommodate your request, young Miko. I really do. But even if we did that, there's still no guarantee that you wouldn't be able to backtrack the vehicle to New Eden if you so desired. It wouldn't really be hard either, considering there isn't a lot of traffic these days, he says with a genuine tone of sorrow in his voice. You have to understand, there's just simply too much about you that I'm ignorant to, so letting you leave is a risk I cannot take. I'm sorry. You're sorry? Really? You're telling me you're going to try and keep us here against our wills, and all you have to say is you're sorry? Phonte says angrily as he steps into the aisleway next to Miko. Yes, young man, I'm very deeply and sincerely sorry. But hey, look, even though New Eden isn't as luxurious as the Hilton or anything, I promise you, life here is paradise compared to what's left out there in the rest of the world. Francis replies with a smile as he makes a poor attempt to lighten the mood with a joke. Phonte pays no attention to the attempt at humor as he steps forward and stops face to face with Francis in the aisleway. If you plan on trying to stop me from leaving, you're going to need more than faithful conviction to do it, old man, Phonte says with a contentious tone of voice as he looks the preacher dead in his bright, icy blue eyes. For a moment, the room gets dead silent until the double doors of the church entranceway can be heard swinging shut behind Phonte and Miko. Breaking his gaze with the preacher to see who has arrived in the church, Phonte turns to face the door behind him and sees Hugo with two of his reckoner friends stepping inside the doorway with Rose in tow behind them. Don't worry, young man. I think we have plenty of faithful conviction lying around. the preachers can be heard saying snidely from behind Phonte. Seeing that the situation was moments away from escalating into a full-out melee, Miko grabs Phonte by the elbow and tries to turn him around to face her, but he doesn't budge. He just stands there, looking down the aisleway toward Hugo and his lackeys with a look of staunch determination as he weighs his options in his head. "Hey, right now would not be a good time for you to try another one of your thick-skulled ideas," she whispers into his ear when he refuses to look at her. "We're outnumbered, and you're only going to make the situation worse." But before she can finish her sentence, Phonte yanks his arm free of her grasp and begins walking down the aisleway toward the three men who were apparently here to make sure that he wouldn't leave. He pays no mind to Miko as he shakes off another one of her attempts to grab his arm and continues stalking toward Hugo with a grim, antagonizing grin sliding across his face. "Well, I'd offer to do this the easy way, but something tells me I should just go ahead and start with the hard way and just get it over with," Phonte says sternly as he cracks his knuckles and attempts to bait Hugo into making the first move. Neither Hugo or his men respond to the verbal threat and instead begin to spread out along the last rows of pews with Hugo in the middle and the two men fanning out to cover his flanks. Miko's mind races through all the potential outcomes of this situation and tries to find an option that will allow them to overcome this predicament, but quickly concludes that there are zero options to make that happen. They have no weapons, they're on unfamiliar territory, and they're hopelessly outnumbered. She thinks to herself that surely Phonte, with the big MIT brain, can see that an all-out confrontation right now is only going to be counterproductive and futile. But when she sees him continuing to advance toward the three reckoners, she decides to make one last effort to dissuade him from going through with this course of action. "Phonte, I know you're smarter than this. Come on, use your head. This is not a problem you can punch your way out of," she says to him, half pleading and half urging. "You should listen to your little girlfriend so nobody has to get hurt today," Hugo says. "And you should really get out of my way," Phonte spats with a raucous tone of voice as he throws his fist right into Hugo's face without any warning. Already anticipating the strike, Hugo swiftly leans back and slips the punch as he tries to deliver a counterpunch to Fonte's torso. But Fonte's already on the move with a quick sidestep that dodges the counterpunch and allows him to plant a vicious left kick directly into Hugo's groin. A look of surprise and disbelief can be seen splayed across his face as the air in his lungs vacates his body and forces him to drop to the floor of the church, curled up into a fetal position. Rose decides now is a good time to get out of the crossfire and begins making her way around the pews as his body goes crashing to the floor near her. In one smooth motion, Phonte turns his focus to the second reckoner on his left just as the brown-haired man named Jonas lunges in his direction and tries to tackle him to the ground. Phonte quickly evades the lunge with a shuffle of his feet and uses the man's own momentum against him as he grabs Jonas's arm, then hip tosses him headfirst into one of the wooden pews on the opposite side of the aisleway. Miko is startled enough to visibly wince as the deafening thud made by the man's head forces him to lose consciousness upon impact. With two of the three men down, Miko finds herself on the brink of cheering as she watches Phonte turn toward the third reckoner named Vincent. She casts a quick glance over her shoulder at Francis, who is standing about 10 feet behind her, and is somewhat surprised to see that the preacher doesn't look worried at all. He just stands there watching, with Rose now back by his side and smiling as if everything was going according to plan, as if he knew something the rest of them did not. With all eyes now back on the fight, Vincent springs into action without hesitation and throws a flurry of punching combinations in quick succession. Phonte gracefully repositions himself in the aisleway with his back to the entrance as he evades and parries the bulk of Vincent's opening strikes. Phonte can tell from the proper stance and technique in Vincent's fighting form that he's probably had combat training of some kind in the past, and is quickly put on the defensive as the flurry continues unabated. Now, unable to keep up with the sheer volume of strikes, Phonte finds himself outpaced by Vincent's relentless attack as a solid right cross connects with his jaw, followed by a left uppercut to the gut that almost folds him right where he stands. Quickly seizing the opportunity to press his attack, Vincent follows up by grabbing the back of Fonte's head and driving his face into an upward knee that sends Phonte staggering backward with his hands clasped to his face. On the floor behind Phonte, the reckoner named Hugo begins to stir as he tries to recover from his injury, but remains unable to rise to his feet for the moment. The preacher and Rose simply stand by one another, holding hands, and look on at the brawl with fascination and intrigue that makes Miko want to punch them both right in the face. Seeing this as an opportunity to end the fight here and now, Vincent darts forward and lands another quick combination to Phonte's midsection as he tries to keep the pressure on. Phonte takes the punishment to the body without much choice and decides to make the best of the situation as he grabs a hold of Vincent's shoulders, then pulls him forward to deliver a vicious headbutt. There's an instant shriek of agonizing pain that reverberates throughout the church with ear-splitting intensity as Vincent clutches his face and blunders backward with blood spraying out from a broken nose. Phonte too staggers back from the force of the blow as his equilibrium is further thrown out of balance and disoriented. He feels his legs wobble underneath him as if they were made of jelly, so he briefly braces himself on one of the pews and tries to shake the cobwebs from his foggy and confused brain. Now, fully recovered from Phonte's sneaky kick to the groin, Hugo jumps to his feet and immediately charges full speed in Phonte's direction with more swiftness than one would expect a large man like Hugo to have. "Phonte, look out behind you!" Miko tries to shout as she sees the large hulk of a man zoom toward her friend from behind, but it's too late and Phonte's too slow. Before Phonte can even turn around and attempt an evasive maneuver, Hugo pounces on him from behind and slaps on a rear naked choke as he tackles him hard to the floor of the church. Feeling instant panic shoot through every nerve of his body, Phonte summons all his strength and tries to break the chokehold so he can escape from Hugo's clutches. He kicks, he tries to gouge his eyes, and he even tries headbutting him with the back of his head. He scuffles and he scraps back in every way he knows how, until the lack of oxygen and blood circulation to his brain causes him to suddenly black out and go limp after about 15 to 20 seconds of struggling. Once he's sure that Phonte is out for good, Hugo slowly releases him from the chokehold, then rises to a kneeling position as he removes a pair of handcuffs from a back holster and slaps them onto Phonte's wrist. With him now secured in restraints, Hugo silently stands up and looks directly at Miko in the middle of the aisleway. Miko's eyes go wide with alarm as she looks back and forth at everyone now surrounding her in the aisleway. Her first instinct is to bolt out of there like a bat out of hell, but she knows the chances of her making a getaway will be just as good as Phonte's chances going 3-on-1 with the Reckoners. Francis smirks to himself as he watches Miko work her way to the same conclusion that he had from the moment they met. They were here to stay. "So what's it going to be, milady?" Francis says endearingly as he steps forward and offers another one of his charming smiles. Knowing that her only option at this point was to acquiesce to the preacher's mandate and accept it, Miko simply raises her hands in a show of surrender and shrugs her shoulders. "As far as I'm concerned, preacher, I kind of always thought the Hilton was overrated anyway," she says with a timid smile of capitulation. To this, Francis can only laugh.